Controlling central squares and opening diagonal lines for the queen and bishop is the immediate goal here. Pioneering the center from the outset, this pawn thrust immediately claims vital central squares and challenges white's initial flank initiative, promising dynamic play. Developing a knight to a central square immediately puts pressure on black's pawn and prepares for further piece activity. Developing the knight naturally addresses central control while preparing for kingside castling. Developing the knight toward the center and preparing castling secures white's king and pressures black's central pawn. Developing this knight solidifies central control and prepares for further piece activity. Building a solid pawn chain ahead of the queenside establishes control and prevents black's immediate piece activity. Boldly challenging central control, black immediately injects dynamism, forcing white into a decision about pawn structure and piece activity. Initiating central pawn exchange opens diagonals for your bishop and creates a dynamic fight for the d-file. Reclaiming the pawn, black immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and opens lines for piece development towards the king, sharpening the queen's influence on the central diagonal. This maneuver prepares to support a d4 pawn push, aiming to seize greater central space and potentially disrupt black's harmonious piece development. Initiating pawn exchanges to disrupt white's queenside initiative, black directly confronts the central pawn structure. This move, while simplifying, opens lines for white's queen and potentially sacrifices some positional harmony in exchange for simplification. Careful attention to piece development now becomes paramount for black to avoid falling behind. Opening the b-file for your rook grants immediate access, but it also leaves your pawn structure on the queenside slightly fragmented, potentially a future target for black's pieces. Developing the bishop to e7 gracefully bolsters the kingside defense and prepares for castling. A prudent step given the open d-file and white's central pawn structure. Opening the e-file for potential rook activity and reinforcing the d4 square while preparing to castle kingside. This move solidifies white's central presence and aims for a comfortable development, potentially leading to a more positional middle game contest where pawn structure and piece coordination will be paramount. Securing the monarch initiates a phase of development, creating a safe haven while preparing to deploy other pieces into the fray. Pushing this pawn immediately challenges black's central presence, aiming to seize the initiative by opening lines for white's pieces and creating a dynamic imbalance. Preparing to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, this maneuver subtly challenges white's central pawn structure while simultaneously freeing the c8 square for potential future piece development. Unpinning the knight and immediately challenging black's bishop creates intricate tactical possibilities and forces a decision regarding piece development and central control. Developing the bishop to this square establishes a crucial diagonal anchor, contesting white's control over the d4 square and preparing for potential counterplay. The piece now eyes the center and offers a solid defensive posture against white's active queen. Liberating the queen's bishop from its restrictive diagonal opens up fascinating possibilities for future pawn advances, potentially creating a powerful outpost on the d5 square by creating an immediate structural imbalance. Accepting the exchange immediately solidifies black's central pawn structure, creating a symmetrical but open game where piece activity will likely dictate the outcome. Liberating the d-file for central pawn pressure. This capture injects immediate tactical intrigue into the position, directly challenging black's bishop on f6 and opening avenues for white's pieces. Repositioning the bishop to its initial square after the exchange on c6 serves to protect the d5 pawn from immediate threats and prepares for potential kingside development, subtly hinting at a long-term strategy of preparing for a pawn push further down the line. Opening up the queen's path. This pawn advance aims to destabilize black's central pawn structure and gain more breathing room for white's pieces, particularly the queen, while simultaneously challenging black's advanced bishop. Black's queen repositions, clearing the e7 square for the bishop and preparing to contest the d-file, all while eyeing the potentially weak pawns on c4. Anchoring the bishop on b2 shores up the queenside pawn structure and offers a stable, if somewhat passive, outpost for the piece, aiming to restrict black's central expansion potential and prepare for a potential kingside buildup. Initiating an aggressive queenside probe. This sortie immediately targets white's central pawn structure and threatens to disrupt black's nascent development by potentially exchanging the queen for a bishop. The queen's newfound mobility on the g4 square creates immediate tactical possibilities, but it also exposes the queen to potential counterattack, making its placement a double-edged sword. Black is gambling that white's response will be less efficient than the potential disruption the queen can cause. Castling queenside signals a bold intention to launch a swift attack down the open c-file, leveraging the newly created diagonal for the queen and bishop, while simultaneously tucking the king away from any immediate central fireworks, preparing for a dynamic confrontation where both monarchs will soon be exposed to the storm. Black immediately challenges the central pawn structure and eyes the vulnerable queen, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create imbalances. This tactical rearrangement seeks to bolster the queen's defense and eye the central pawn mass, preparing for potential breakthroughs or evasive maneuvers should black's knight on f6 become a more potent threat to the kingside. Opening the d-file for the rook. Rf d8 is a natural development aimed at contesting the open central column, subtly preparing for potential pawn pushes or even a daring rook sacrifice if opportunities arise. Down the road, this solidifies black's presence in the center and adds pressure to white's slightly exposed queen and king. Safeguarding the monarch now becomes paramount as the rook embarks on a centralizing journey, aiming to bolster the king's defenses and potentially participate in future pawn storms along the kingside. Black's bishop, now returning to its natural diagonal after a brief excursion, seeks to regain central influence and potentially eye the kingside via the h7b1 diagonal, setting up a subtle positional dance around the d4 pawn. Reclaiming the initiative. This rook maneuver aims to disrupt black's burgeoning influence on the queenside and establish a more dynamic presence along the d-file, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities that were absent just moments before. The bishop's retreat to g6 cleverly creates a pin along the d-file, aiming to disrupt white's rook and queen coordination, while simultaneously offering a pawn sacrifice to open lines for black's pieces towards the kingside. Unleashing an aggressive pawn thrust into the center, white seeks to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and potentially open lines towards the enemy king, though this bold advance may create weaknesses on the kingside for white if not properly supported. Exposing the enemy monarch to immediate danger. Black forces white into a defensive posture, potentially disrupting white's intended kingside expansion by demanding attention towards the vulnerable central squares and creating a compelling dynamic where white must prioritize king safety over further development or aggressive intentions. Reclaiming the central queen's square and redeploying the monarch to a more secure position after the forced repositioning. Initiating an exchange of queens now forces a fundamental shift. potentially ushering in an endgame where piece activity will be paramount. Black is smartly recognizing the opportunity to simplify while maintaining reasonable activity for their remaining forces. Accepting this pawn exchange solidifies white's central structure, creating a more robust pawn shield for the king, though it does surrender the bishop pair and opens the f-file for black's rooks to potentially exploit later on. Initiating a bold pawn push, black aims to disrupt white's central control and create counterplay by challenging the d4 pawn, potentially opening the c-file for future activity. Clearing the central file heralds an endgame transition, potentially favoring white's centralized king and active rook, though black's bishop pair offers positional compensation. The exchange on d8 significantly simplifies the position, presenting black with a clear path to neutralize white's activity and transition into a more comfortable endgame. By recapturing with the rook, black secures the central file and avoids the complications that might arise from other pieces. This choice prioritizes positional solidity and aims to exploit the open lines that will inevitably present themselves as the game progresses, offering a chance to outmaneuver white in the simplified material situation. Pivoting the knight to d2 secures the pawn on c4 and prepares a potential regrouping to either c4 or e4, aiming to improve piece activity and challenge black's central grip. Re-establishing contact between the king's bishop and the queenside pawns offers a new avenue for activity, but relinquishes the bishop's defensive post, potentially creating vulnerabilities down the light squares should white manage to exploit them. Re-establishing the rook's active presence on the open file. This repositioning allows white to potentially pressure black's weakened kingside pawn structure should the bishop move, while also preparing to contest the d-file more effectively. A daring thrust, aiming to activate the rook and pressure white's somewhat uncoordinated pieces. This pawn push opens up critical lines, forcing white to make decisions about the fate of their isolated passed pawn on the d-file and potentially creating long-term weaknesses. The intention is clear. Inject activity into black's position and disrupt white's developing harmony. Consider the geometry. The rook now has a diagonal view towards white's king, and the pawn on c5 directly challenges white's control of central squares, hinting at a more aggressive, dynamic approach in the ensuing middle game. There's a palpable tension created here. Black is not afraid to provoke tactical skirmishes and exploit any minor inaccuracies in white's setup, transforming the queenside pawn structure into a dynamic asset. Solidifying the king's position becomes paramount as the board simplifies, a necessary defensive measure against black's active pieces. The rook's journey across the board, culminating in a threat to the central pawns, orchestrates a crucial shift in pressure, forcing white's king into a precarious defensive posture. The rook exchange simplifies the position, aiming to activate the remaining pieces and exploit the open files, particularly the d-file now. After a series of aggressive exchanges that have somewhat destabilized black's central pawn structure, the pawn on e3 is now deeply entrenched, and black's bishop on e3 is a formidable piece, controlling vital diagonals and putting pressure on white's somewhat exposed king. This bishop's placement dramatically alters the dynamic, aiming to disrupt white's nascent coordination and potentially open lines for further activity. The monarch's journey begins, venturing out from its protective cocoon into the emerging complexities of a pawn-heavy endgame, aiming to activate itself for crucial defensive and offensive duties in the center and on the queenside, potentially steering the game towards favorable exchanges by seizing central squares before black's pawns can solidify their advanced positions. Seizing the opportunity to eliminate white's active bishop, Black initiates a decisive exchange that will simplify the position and push towards a more favorable endgame. This maneuver not only removes a potential threat but also opens lines for Black's remaining pieces, particularly the rook on the d-file, which can now become much more active. The resulting material balance, while equal in pawns and minor pieces, leaves White with a slightly awkward king position and Black with better piece coordination. The White king boldly ventures forward, initiating the endgame by claiming central presence and preparing to support the remaining pawns on the queen side, even though it leaves itself exposed to potential checks from the Black bishop. The Black bishop, finally escaping its pawn-lined confinement, reclaims a vital outpost on e4, immediately challenging White's central pawn structure and threatening to disrupt the king's meager shelter. Fortifying the king's immediate surroundings becomes paramount now, preventing any further penetration by the opposing bishop and consolidating the pawn structure's integrity before contemplating active piece play or pushing the queenside pawns. Bringing the bishop back to its post on f5 solidifies control of the light squares and prepares to contest the open d-file, a crucial territorial battleground in this simplified structure. The monarch abandons the safety of the central square, venturing into territory that suddenly feels much more exposed. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure is the primary goal, preventing further incursions from White's remaining pieces and creating a more resilient defensive setup. Reactivating the bishop's influence along the c1h6 diagonal aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure and prepare for potential breakthroughs, even as it temporarily vacates the d-file. Consolidating the bishop's position on e6 solidifies Black's central pawn structure and prepares for a potential exchange of pieces that could simplify into a more favorable endgame for Black. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal creates a subtle, yet potent, pressure point on Black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit any static weaknesses that might arise in the ensuing exchanges. Expanding the queenside pawn chain offers a solid, albeit passive, way to consolidate Black's position, aiming to improve piece activity on the wings after the earlier exchanges. Unlocking the kingside space race, White initiates a pawn advance, seeking to gain a foothold and potentially create weaknesses in Black's pawn structure. Safeguarding the monarch from potential diagonal threats by repositioning it to the more secure corner of the board. Unlocking the potential of the now clear d file requires a vigilant eye on the opposing king's shelter. The bishop's repositioning aims to both bolster this assault and preempt any counter-thrusts from Black's bishop lurking on the long diagonal. The Black king emerges from its shelter, a bold maneuver seeking active participation in the unfolding scenario, hinting at a desire to exploit the weakened central dark squares and potentially establish a more commanding presence on the queenside. Shifting the bishop to the flank aims to support the pawn advance, potentially creating a passed pawn while also keeping an eye on the central square d6. The Black king bravely ventures forward, seeking active participation in this endgame, though it exposes itself to potential threats from the remaining white pieces. The king now ventures out, a bold step seeking active participation in the dwindling material, hoping to disrupt Black's centralized pieces and create opportunities where none seemed apparent. Challenging the pawn chain's integrity, Black boldly advances their monarch, seeking a direct confrontation and aiming to exploit the newly created open diagonals for king activity. The king's journey to the queenside, while seemingly audacious, carves out a new path for the white monarch in a simplified position, aiming to disrupt the established pawn structure and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses. on that flank, unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside. Black attempts to disrupt white's centralized king and create weaknesses in the enemy pawn structure, aiming to exploit the open lines that might arise. Opening the h-file promises a decisive assault, leveraging the freed-up pawn to create a potent attacking spearhead against the exposed black king. The pawn chain on white's kingside, so carefully constructed, now breaks apart, opening a crucial pathway for the black king to approach the center and potentially become a formidable attacking piece in the ensuing endgame.